welcome back to the second International Chronic Pain Virtual Summit 2021. Next up, we have Mark Pugh. Mark Pugh is a passionate educator and an agitator known as RX Professor. Mark is focused on the intersection of chronic pain and appropriate treatment, particularly as it relates to the clinical and financial implications of opioids, benzodiazepines, and other prescription painkillers. He's a strong champion of workers' compensation industry to clean up the mess, a movement that he's created to drive attention to the importance of individualized, appropriate treatment for injured workers. Mark is a vocal advocate of the biopsychosocial model of treatment for chronic pain.
Thanks, Dev. What I'm going to be presenting to you is the NICE guidelines for chronic pain and how they might be, you might learn from our experience in the United States, because as you probably know, we've had some significant issues with the opioid epidemic. In fact, it actually started here in the United States a long time ago. So I'm excited to bring to you some experience on what we've gone through, some of our solutions that we've represented, and then how those might relate to the proposed NICE guidelines. So I want to first talk about the opioid epidemic in the United States. It really started in the mid-1990s, and there were four different things that really started this process. They weren't strategic in nature. They weren't, that there wasn't a collaboration in some back room that says, hey, let's do all these four things together and we'll kill a bunch of people. But as it turned out, that kind of is what happened, because in the mid-1990s, these four things happened. Doctors were accused of undertreating pain after being accused previously of overtreating pain and having too many opioids. So doctors were really put in a very difficult position. But in the mid-1990s, the pendulum has swung and said, you're not doing what you need to do in order to treat pain. And unfortunately, about the same time, Purdue Pharma launched their product called OxyContin. And they knew what they had. They've just been pled guilty to 3 felony counts as a company, and they're going to pay several $100 billion in restitution. And that was not because of the product they created, but because of the mismarketing of it and saying that it was not addictive and it could be used for chronic pain when it was really meant for use for acute pain. It was very narrow in scope of what the FDA approved, but they marketed it way beyond that. And they've paid a lot of fines over a period of time. And so that came at the same time as that we've got a magic pill. Then pain was added as the 5th vital sign. And those of you that are clinicians, you understand, well, even non-clinicians, you understand that pain is subjective. It's not objective like your heart rate or your temperature, but it was treated as that 5th vital sign. And so when patients came in and said, I got pain, one of the first things they were asked was, what is your pain level on a scale of 1 to 10, frowny face to smiley face? And they treated that as sacrosanctly, as really as objectively as their temperature and pulse rate. And interestingly enough, in 2016, the American Medical Association and JCO both backed off of that and said, you know what, it had good intentions, but actually created some bad intentions or bad conclusions. And then finally, the Press Ganey patient satisfaction surveys, where we asked patients how they felt that they were treated in this process, especially in and around their pain. And there's lots of evidence that showed that doctors changed their treating patterns, their behavior, in regards to making sure that they got really good patient satisfaction surveys. They wanted that 10 out of 10 so that they could continue to see that patient, they could continue to get reimbursed. Maybe they could have that opportunity to become the medical director eventually. And so doctors changed their behavior in order to satisfy patients. Again, patient satisfaction is highly subjective. And when a patient feels that they were not treated fairly or that their pain was not controlled properly, then that ended up being a negative scar on the doctor. So all those things happened in the mid-1990s, and we have seen the results, thousands and thousands and thousands of people that have passed away. I don't know if you're a baseball fan, but in the United States, we have the Major League Baseball Association and Baseball Hall of Fame, so the best of the best. And there was a gentleman named Roy Halladay, who was a pitcher there. He had severe anxiety, though, and if you think of celebrities, and certainly baseball players and sports in general are celebrities here in the United States, if you want to be a celebrity and have public anxiety, severe anxiety, that's pretty much that's a bad combination. And oftentimes he had lots of injuries, and they introduced him to opioids. The trainers for the club introduced him to opioids to manage his pain. And ultimately in November of 2017, he crashed his plane in the ocean, and he had a muscle relaxant, an opioid, a sleep aid, morphine, and an antidepressant in his system. So he developed an addiction to painkillers and obviously a variety of other things by being introduced to them by trying to pitch through the pain. But we've had a number of other people, celebrities in the United States, who have died from opioids. Prince, the musical artist, was addicted to prescription painkillers, and it was fake fentanyl that actually killed him in 2016. Philip Seymour Hoffman, who is a well-known actor, he had drug and alcohol abuse in college, but he died from a heroin and prescription opioid overdose in 2014. In fact, when the cops came in and found him, he still had the needle in his arm. Rush Limbaugh, who's conservative radio host in the United States, he publicly confirmed his addiction to oxycodone and hydrocodone in 2003. And then Rex Chapman, who's an NBA National Basketball Association player, became addicted to prescription painkillers while he was a player in the NBA. And then he was crying out for help because he was arrested for shoplifting. You think about the millions of dollars he made as a professional athlete in 2014. And it took him 3 drug rehabs for him to finally become clean. So, but beyond those celebrities, we've had non-celebrities, we've had teenagers, we've had nurses, we've had attorneys, we've had pastors, we've had dads and moms and sons and daughters and uncles and aunts who have died from prescription overdose. So this all started in mid-1990s, and it just has had a dramatic negative effect. But the overdose and the opioid epidemic really has had 3 different waves. The first wave was the overprescribing of opioids. The second wave was the transition to heroin because patients or individuals were not able to get their drugs from the doctor, but their dealers on the street that were selling them OxyContin on the street said, hey, I can get you a better high for cheaper, and used heroin. And these were not the junkies from the 60s and 70s. Again, these were attorneys, pastors, chief executives, sons, daughters, anybody that you can think of. And so that was the second wave. And then the third wave really was the synthetic opioids, and that's around the fentanyl analogs. And it's not the fentanyl that's used for childbirth, but it's the fentanyl that's oftentimes manufactured in China and shipped through the United States Postal Service or FedEx or UPS into the United States. And a lot of different fentanyl analogs that have come off patent, and they're constantly making new stuff. And so you see the introduction of that third wave, that the vast majority of opioid overdoses now are not related to prescription opioids, not even related to heroin. It's related to the fentanyl and the analogs. And unfortunately, all of those particular drugs has increased in potency. I noticed the most recent data from the Office for National Statistics in the UK in 2017 showed that fentanyl was present on the death certificate of 75 drug-induced deaths registered in England and Wales. And the fentanyl analogs were present in 31 cases. So that's 2017 data. That's 3-4 years ago. You can imagine that the hockey stick jump for us is probably true for you guys as well. And when you look at the total number of deaths, you can see again how they have transitioned over time. And unfortunately, as of January of 2020, it's a rolling 12-month, they really haven't updated it, but there's 50,704 opioid deaths, or 139 per day in the United States. The good news is it has somewhat plateaued. It had somewhat plateaued in 2017, but you can see it's increasing in 2020. And one of the things that we're finding is that COVID is impacting that. I don't know if you've heard of deaths of despair. I've been following that basically since I've been shut in my room since March of last year. And the deaths of despair are a real thing. Increased calls to suicide hotlines, increased alcoholism, increased use of drugs, and overdose and fatalities from that. And I think, when we look at the mental health issues of people being locked in, people losing their jobs, people losing their businesses, and not being able to open back up again, people not having their kids available to go to school, and then having to be the teacher and the employee and the parent all at the same time. All those mental health issues I personally think that as many unfortunate, tragic instances of people dying from COVID, and I actually have a family member who died from COVID, so I understand how tragic it is. But with all that tragic nature of that, I think the even more tragic is going to be the long-term mental health issues related to COVID and the lockdown, the isolation, everything that comes from that. And so what we're seeing is an increase in opioid overdoses. So even though the epidemic had kind of leveled off, unfortunately, we're seeing it ramp back up again because people just can't get there and do anything with it. So who's responsible for all of this? Well, big pharma, certainly. And I want to separate big pharma from big opioid pharma. Big pharma helps us live longer with diabetes and cardio issues and all the different comorbid conditions that we have that we can live with now that used to kill us, cancer, et cetera. Big opioid pharma is a completely different story. So they're responsible, but also prescribers are responsible for prescribing too many. Pharmacists for not asking the right questions and pushing back. The pushers, the drug cartels, as I mentioned, that second and third wave is not about legitimately prescribed opioids, but it's about the illicit opioids. The payers and the insurance companies who continue to reimburse for that. The politicians, the policymakers, the regulators, those that were asleep at the switch and not recognizing that what they had created needed to come back and be fixed. The plaintiffs' attorneys, the ones that are representing injured workers or patients in general, and then patients themselves, not looking at drugs.com or other resources or even just reading the label on those particular drugs. The good news is that there is some accountability associated with that. OxyContin, as I mentioned, has pled guilty to 3 felony accounts as a company, and they're basically going to go away as a company. So there has been some accountability, but there's a lot of people that were responsible for that. So what was the response in the United States? Well, I wrote this blog post about 4 years ago, Appropriate, Not Zero Opioids, because I saw us talking in the United States. And again, since I've been involved in it from 2003, I saw it when we were treating opioids like candy and just giving it out to anybody. General practitioners, orthopedic surgeons, PM&R doctors, nurse practitioners, dentists, veterinarians, anybody and everybody was handing out opioids as if they had no consequence whatsoever. And then people figured out that there was a consequence. And then the pendulum swung the other direction. And now there's a large number of doctors that don't want to touch opioids whatsoever, which I get. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency in the United States, is definitely looking over their shoulder and looking for high prescribers. But they dropped patients without any kind of regard for the tolerance, the addiction that they had built up, and said, I'm not doing opioids, hope you have a good life. That wasn't appropriate, because then that patient really was stuck in a very difficult situation, because oftentimes they were complex cases that other doctors didn't want to take on to account either. So my argument in this blog post is we got to find the right balance. Giving them out like candy, giving opioids out like candy is not appropriate, but giving no opioids out whatsoever and dropping patients who are on opioids right now like a hot potato is not appropriate either. We got to find the right balance. There is a role for opioids in acute pain, even in chronic pain, but definitely not to the extent that we were handing them out like that. So definitely, if you're interested, read that blog post. So there were a variety of different government tactics that we did here in the United States, which again, I'm giving you some background to kind of understand maybe where the UK is going with their NICE guidelines. But there was presidential leadership. In 2011, they published the first kind of white paper, if you will, on the epidemic. The CARA Act, Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, was passed in 2016, and it was a coordinated response of a variety of different things. It was talking about prevention and treatment, recovery, law enforcement, criminal justice reform, and overdose reversal. So you can look at those 7 items and go, okay, they pretty much covered all the bases, and it allocated $181 million per year to fund that kind of thing. And then in 2017, the opioid epidemic was declared a public health emergency. So, again, a little bit late to the party because 2011 is obviously, 20 years after, it started. But they did come to bear, and they brought their policy associated with that. They also expanded PDMP, or prescription drug monitoring programs. In every state except Missouri now in the United States, the states have a PDMP, which is an electronic database of all prescriptions, typically all controlled substances, Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4 are uploaded in there. And then doctors and especially pharmacists can look at this and look for people who are getting refills too quickly, who are doctor shopping, taking this, trying to get multiple scripts from different doctors, or pharmacy hopping, where they're getting one script where they're going to multiple pharmacies and trying to fill it multiple times. And so we've really focused on giving information into the hands of pharmacists and doctors, especially, to try to understand those red flags. The Drug Enforcement Agency is outlines and has 2 different take-back days in the spring and in the fall. And they're really, what they're trying to do is to get drugs out of medicine cabinets, which, if you can think of someone who has a fairly short duration of pain, but was given a 30-day supply of opioids, which absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. If they've got 27 days left over, those 27 days end up in the medicine cabinet, and then they take them inappropriately later. Someone in their family or friends or visitors steals them from the medicine cabinet, and they become a part of the illicit marketplace. And so there's been a real focus on getting that excess opioids out of medicine cabinets, out of homes. And then a lot of accessibility for medication-assisted treatment, buprenorphine, naltrexone, methadone, giving access to that to help people wean off of opioids and that addiction, as well as a focus again on naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal drug. And as bad as the numbers have been in the United States, they would be tenfold worse if we didn't have naloxone, because I've read some statistics that show for every fatal opioid overdose death, there are at least 10 non-fatal opioid overdoses. And so you can imagine, if someone wasn't there to administer naloxone, we would have a great larger number of people that would have died from that. So other things that we have done, we've seen the rise of prescription alternates, NSAIDs, like naproxen, meloxicam, Celebrex, diclofenac, ibuprofen, acetaminophen. Those have increased in prescribing. In fact, there's more prescriptions of NSAIDs now, especially for acute pain, than there are for opioids, which is good, except obviously NSAIDs, there are some negative repercussions for using them long term. Benzodiazepines like Xanax and Valium. One of the things I found in 2003 is not just the opioid issue of overprescribing, but benzodiazepines were massively overprescribed back in the mid-1990s as well, and continue to be. And they're significant. Weaning off of a benzodiazepine is as difficult and maybe even more challenging than weaning off of an opioid. And they have significant issues. And then gabapentinoids, Lyrica, Neurontin. The UK made both gabapentin and pregabalin Class C drugs in April 2019, and we're seeing an increase in scheduling here in the United States. Right now, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, Michigan, and Virginia have gabapentin as a Schedule 5, which is the equivalent of the Class C. And the reason why we're seeing that increase is because there's a street price for gabapentinoids, and because they increase the efficacy of the opioids. They make the high higher. And so anytime you see a street price, you can see that there's abuse and misuse going on. And that's when you start to ramp down and start to reschedule different things like that. So, we've seen a change in those prescription alternatives. We've also seen an increase in medical cannabis. I've been talking and writing about medical cannabis since 2014. So again, I've been kind of on the front end of this in the United States. And interesting, in the United Kingdom, 12.3% of 16 to 34-year-olds use cannabis, and it was ranked number 1 and number 2 in top 5 drugs seized for drug law offenses. So, it's a significant issue for the UK, but it's legal in the vast majority of the United States. In fact, we had ballot initiatives in 5 states on November 3rd of 2020, and each of those 5 states, the ballot initiative won in legalizing either recreational and or medical marijuana. We've actually only got 3 states now in the United States that doesn't have some form of legalization of cannabis at this point. So that's a significant alternative to painkillers here in the United States. And then we've seen a rise, fortunately, of a lot of non-prescription drugs or alternatives, that non-pharma treatment like yoga and Tai Chi and acupuncture and dry needling, mindfulness apps, massage, aroma, and music therapy, a variety of different things like that. We've seen a dramatic increase in the use of psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, motivational interviewing. I started advocating for a biopsychosocial treatment model back in 2011 and started talking about cognitive behavioral therapy. And the vast majority of people didn't want to pay for it and didn't really understand it. But there's a lot more people that are open to it and see the evidence behind it. Virtual reality. I happen to be on the advisory board for a company called Harvard MedTech, which provides a virtual reality therapy a platform for the treatment of acute and chronic pain. And I've learned a lot about neuroplasticity and how important the brain is to pain, and how virtual reality through immersion and distraction and escape can help people better manage their pain. Interdisciplinary pain management, functional restoration programs that have an MD or a DO, that have a behavioral psychologist, have a physical therapist involved in that. It's really important to have that kind of interdisciplinary, team oriented, and it's been kind of a roller coaster ride on that. But for people who are really deeply addicted and have complex psychosocial comorbidities and physical comorbidities, the interdisciplinary pain management program really has a lot of benefit and efficacy to it. Telemedicine is something that obviously has increased in COVID, the whole concept of virtual, the fact that we're doing this virtually, that the acceptance of telemedicine, people that are using telemedicine that ordinarily would not call a doctor, doctors that are using telemedicine to deliver care that would not ordinarily have done it. And I have seen a relaxation of regulations and statutes relating telemedicine. I'm not sure what has happened where you're at right now, but personally, I think that relaxation will go from temporary to permanent, because patients are going to expect the convenience of telemedicine, and doctors like the increased scalability that telemedicine gives them of being able to see more patients. And then finally, an advocacy claims model. The possibility of treating the whole person, looking at the mind, body, and soul, which gets to that biopsychosocial spiritual treatment model, establishing and in reinforcing and empowering a recovery mindset, that they're going to be active in their mind and in their body. And then when you're talking about the brain and the neuroplasticity, the natural organic thing that happens from the moment that you're born until the moment until you die, where you're laying down new neural pathways, either negative or positive, and how you can embrace and actually leverage neuroplasticity in order to help you better manage and understand and treat the pain. The belief system of an individual, instead of feeling that you're depressed and sad and hurt, confused and unloved and lonely, instead you can have the belief system that I'm fine, the half glass full as opposed to half glass empty type of person who focus more on positivity than negativity. And then ultimately behavior, because there's a lot of people that are taking drugs or taking treatment that really being more physically fit, getting more quality sleep of 7 to 8 hours, eating more nutritious foods, being better hydrated, things that you can completely control. When you talk about the locus of control, the internal locus of control or self-efficacy is what you want. You want to equip and empower people to be able to do things themselves, not to rely on somebody or something else to take care of their pain and take care of their situation, but to empower and embolden and equip them to be able to manage that. And so we have been on this roller coaster in the United States from not really thinking about whole person, not really thinking more about the biomedical model. And because the opioid epidemic, one of the silver linings, if you will, from that is this reversal and understanding that in order to treat someone, you really need to treat the whole person. And I use this example oftentimes is we have seen in workers' compensation where I work, if you're a clinician, you've seen this. If you're just a human being, you've probably seen this. Two different people had the same medical condition, medical issue. They had competent care, and they didn't have any complications. And yet one person returned to function, returned to life, returned to work, and the other person went south. What was the difference? It wasn't the condition. It wasn't the competence of the care. It wasn't the lack of complications. It was something inside of here that was not working properly, from baggage, emotional, physical, psychological baggage, things that have happened. All of these things build into it, and they didn't respond. They didn't have the resilience that they needed in order to manage that. And so we have learned the hard way that in order to get really good outcomes, you have to focus on the whole person. And so one of the aspects of this was, in order to, again, kind of narrow down and help people understand this, the CDC launched their guidelines in 2016. And interestingly enough, different from NICE, the NICE proposed guidelines, we started at age 18 in primary care settings. And then the Veterans Affairs, for ex-military and current military, Department of Defense, they created their own guidelines that use the CDC guidelines in 2017. But I'm going to take you through some of the best practices, because I think as you read the NICE guidelines, you're going to see some similarities and you're going to definitely see some differentiation. The CDC guidelines said opioids are not first-line therapy, that you really should focus on non-pharmacological and non-opioid pharmacological therapy first. You should establish goals for pain and function. That sounds like really good common sense, right? You don't start something, you don't start anything in life without having some kind of goal. And so that initial discussion is like, where are we going? What do we want to do? What are the possibilities from this? And understand and establish those goals between the provider and the patient. You want to discuss the risks and benefits of all the treatment options. Every treatment option, other than drinking a lot of water, probably has some potential negative side effects. And so what are the risks? What are the benefits? And help them weigh those differentiations. If you are going to start opioids, you need to start with immediate release first. You never start with extended release or opioids like an OxyContin. You should always start with immediate release. You should always start with the lowest effective dose. And what they came up with was 50 morphine milligram equivalents per day is basically the floor. And then 90 MME is when you really need to start worrying about, are they taking too much? Interestingly enough, when we first started doing drug formularies and whatnot in the United States, back in the early 2010, 2011, 120 was our floor. And so the CDC looked at the evidence and said, no, as soon as you hit 50, you need to start thinking about that. And if you're not familiar with MME, it's just a source of comparison, because all the different opioids have different levels of potency. And it's really important to calculate the total MME from all the different opioids, add them up, and then that's what you get. And if it's greater than 50 or if it's greater than 90, you need to reevaluate that. Prescribe short durations for acute pain. Most of the states at this point in the United States have some level of limit on the number of days supply that you can give an individual during acute pain. The lowest one is in Florida, which is 3 days. So by default, you probably understand and maybe have even received a 30-day supply just by default. You don't even think about it. Doctor doesn't think about it. Pharmacist doesn't think about it. Just, you got pain, let's give you 30 days. Well, if you've got a day and a half worth of pain, 30 days means you're going to have a lot of unused opioids. And so we have established that maximum. In large cases, it's usually somewhere around 5 days is what typically has been enacted by the state, but you can see the CDC guidelines say really 3 days is the max. And you need to constantly evaluate the benefits and the harms, constantly reassess the risk versus benefit. So it's not something you get on a, almost a cookie cutter, you do the same thing every day, every visit. You could just photocopy office visit notes from visit to visit to visit, because they're exactly the same thing. You need to constantly be aware of and be cognizant that things can change, and to constantly look at the risks and benefits and the harms associated with that. So that was some guidelines, and you can see the CDC guidelines really went beyond the opioids. It evaluated and really recommended non-opioids, but it didn't say no opioid whatsoever, which is a little bit different than what the NICE proposed guidelines are. So let's go into what the NICE guidelines have said. I found this nice little graphic on the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, posted in 2019, but it's 2016 data. So like in the United States, your data is 2 or 3 years lagging when you publish it. But you reported a record number of drug-related deaths in 2016. That was an increasing trend since 2012. Opioids, primarily heroin, again, that second wave that we had over here, but also methadone were involved in the majority of deaths. 90% of them were related not to prescription opioids, but to heroin and methadone. And the drug-induced mortality rate among adults in the UK aged 15 to 64 was 74 deaths per million in 2016. The good news is that's a lot less in the United States. The bad news is that's still a lot of individuals, a lot of family members, a lot of communities, a lot of companies, a lot of political organizations, a lot of people that are impacted regardless. So the UK certainly has an issue, just like any other country with drug abuse and issues. So the NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, has proposed the Chronic Pain in Over 16s Assessment and Management Guidelines. Interestingly enough, when I first started looking at this in October of last year, the expected publication date was the 20th of January, which is coming up here pretty soon. When I'm recording this, it's 2 days from now. Obviously, that's not going to happen because they changed it to be confirmed. So there is no firm date for when they might be proposed. And from what I have gathered in conversations, it seems like they got a lot of feedback and not all of it was positive. And they're trying to figure out how to incorporate that feedback into the ultimate guidelines that get published. Again, it's for patients 16 and older, which is a little bit different than our CDC guidelines, which is 18. And really, they're adjunctive guidelines. They're not standalone. They're to be used alongside guidelines for specific conditions that cause pain. So if you're interested in doing your own research, and I presume that you'll have access to this PowerPoint as a handout, but I gave you the links for the entire kind of platform of everything, which includes the evidence, includes the recommendations. They go into great detail as to how they came up with these recommendations. That's the all documents. And then if you want to actually see the draft version that was published in August, so far it has not been updated. I think, again, as they're accommodating the feedback, there's the links to that. So what do they contain? It's assessing all types of chronic primary pain with a focus on understanding and individualization, which I completely agree with. As you read the guidelines, it's clear that they understand that there is not a single treatment plan that works for every individual person. There is no cookie cutter. You cannot say, because your name starts with M, that this is your treatment plan. Every individual is different. The source of their pain is different. How long they've had the pain is different. How they have dealt with pain in the past is different. Psychosocial issues that have made them the person that they are different. Their physical, medical conditions, comorbidities are different. Their age is different. Their genders, everything is different. Their DNA is different. Their body chemistry is different. So if you think that an individual treatment is going to treat every single person, that's just nonsensical. And I really appreciated their guidelines, really focusing on the individualization, the fact that you really need to have the patients participate in their care, to have active bi-directional communication. It's not the doctor just talking at the patient, but it's having that dialogue with the patient, helping understand where they're coming from and relaying information, educating them on that. Oftentimes, majority of the times, the doctor is probably the most educated person in the room about clinical stuff. But the patient is the one most educated on themselves. And so you need to understand and pass that information back and forth. And you really need to focus, and this was another thing that guidelines really focused on, was a shared decision-making. This wasn't a didactic lecture. This wasn't the doctor going, this is what you're going to do, and the patient just humbly bowing and say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, this is what I'm going to do. It's a shared decision. It's sharing information. It's actively communicating. It's open-ended conversation and empathetic listening. and figuring out between them as a team what's going to work properly. And again, they focused on that whole person, the biopsychosocial approach, not just on the management, but the ultimate assessment, the upfront assessment. What's going on? What has happened? What's the fears? What's the anxiety? What's the depression? What's your concerns at home? What's your concerns with your family? What's your concerns with your job? All that kind of stuff needs to factor into it. Now, obviously, that's much more difficult to do from a primary practicing physician in having that kind of dialogue than just going, boom, here it is. 5 minutes later, I've got everything nailed down. I've published it in the electronic medical records, and here's your script and go out. Having this kind of dialogue and having that shared decision making means a lot more dialogue and probably more time between the physician and the patient, but you're going to get better outcomes. So they recommended, the guidelines recommended exercise. Yeah, that's kind of a no-brainer. Psychological therapy, they recommended cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance commitment therapy. They recommended acupuncture with some caveats. And just to let you know, acupuncture has been accepted by Medicare here in the United States, which is the medical insurance for people over 65 years old. And Medicare has approved acupuncture. They looked at the science and they said acupuncture is appropriate for low back chronic pain. And so NICE guidelines kind of came to that same conclusion, although it's important for you to read what the caveats are. They mentioned mindfulness and manual therapy, but they said that it was somewhat inconclusive and then needed more research. And they did not recommend biofeedback or electrical physical modalities for chronic pain. But they made this bold statement. This is what really separates NICE guidelines from the CDC guidelines. They said there's no evidence identified on the effectiveness of opioids for chronic primary pain. So they're basically saying you can't use opioids for chronic pain. As you recall, hopefully, maybe my previous discussion on the CDC guidelines, they said they didn't rule out opioids for pain, whether it be acute or chronic. They just said be very, very careful, start at the lowest effective dose. Start with immediate release, be very careful and understand the risk versus benefits, constantly evaluate them. NICE guidelines kind of went the other end of the spectrum and said, nah, not going to happen. So from a pharma standpoint, they've said, consider antidepressants, but don't offer by any route, opioids, NSAIDs, benzos, anti-epileptics or gabapentinoids, and local anesthetics. So that takes a lot of stuff off the table in regards to treatment of chronic pain. And probably that's why they haven't published their guidelines, because that's going the other ends of the spectrum, right? And there's probably a lot of people that don't agree with that and have provided their feedback to that. But they do at least make the understanding that if you are currently on any of those drugs, especially opioids, that the patient needs to have explanation of the risk of continuing that. And you need to understand, both the doctor and the patient, the problems associated with withdrawal. As I mentioned, the tapering weaning process for opioids is difficult. The weaning and tapering process for benzodiazepines is equally, if not more, dangerous and complex associated with that. So if you're already using it, if you're already using some of those drugs, you definitely can't just go, you can't get them anymore and take them off cold turkey. It needs to be strategic. It needs to be thoughtful. It needs to be methodical. In some cases, it needs to be led by someone who's been there, done that, and understands how to do that and how to taper them and so forth. And so it's really important not to drop people that are using these drugs just indiscreetly and just go, you can't get them anymore. And they recognize that. So what are the implications? Well, you need to change clinical behavior, clinician behavior. So all the clinicians need to understand and know the guidelines. They need to read the guidelines in full, understand it, highlight it, underline it, print it out, put it on. You need to understand the guidelines. And again, they may be modified, so you can look at them now. Chances are whatever is made official is going to be somewhat different. You need to focus, if you're not already, you need to focus on that whole person approach, in that bi-directional dialogue, and you need to focus on self-efficacy. You need to focus on empowering them and equipping that individual to be able to manage that pain themselves. And you need to have that more consultative kind of approach and asking more open-ended questions, which obviously is going to probably require more time in each office visit. One of the discussions that we're having in the United States is, if we really want to put our money where our mouth is, we can't say be more aware of biopsychosocial issues, be more empathetic, be more open-ended, be more dialogue-based kind of treatment, and require them to do all that in 15 minutes. We're having an ongoing discussion that is going to require more time, and the payers need to be open to paying for that additional time, because doctors aren't going to do stuff for free. There's no reason to expect them to do stuff for free. And so we're having that discussion. What is the appropriate time? Instead of in 10 or 15-minute increments, is it 30-minute increments? What should we expect in that initial evaluation? So we're going through kind of, okay, we've understood academically, we've understood intellectually, we understand in our heart and our gut that whole person treatment is the most appropriate and is going to have the best clinical, repeatable kind of outcomes. But how does that translate into dollars and cents? And that's something that you're going to have to wrestle with as well as you kind of put your arms around this. That multidisciplinary approach is really important. If a doctor can treat from a biomedical standpoint, can treat a compound fracture, but if that compound fracture results in infections and results in an amputation, then you're going to have psychosocial issues. You're going to have vocational issues. You're going to have all sorts of different things, prosthetics. You're just going to have so many things that you're going to have to think about that goes well beyond the biomedical issue, because that's going to mess with their brain because they don't have part of the leg anymore. And how do you manage that? How do you deal with that? How do you change your life? How do you change your behavior? So that multidisciplinary approach in the appropriate circumstances is really important. And really everybody, not just behavioral psychologists and psychiatrists, but everybody understanding what neuroplasticity means. If you don't know what neuroplasticity is, please Google it. Please, do your research on it. Look at different articles. It's really, really important to understand, because if you can embrace and empower and engage and supercharge neuroplasticity that naturally happens, again, organically, laying down new neural pathways constantly. Our brain is chemically and biologically and physically changing from the moment that you are born until the moment until you die. And how can you leverage that in order to lay down positive neural pathways, new good habits, new better ways of thinking about things? How can you retrain the brain in thinking about pain? Because ultimately, pain isn't pain until it hits the brain. Just because you burn your finger on a stove doesn't mean that that's pain, because your peripheral nerves don't make any judgment calls as to your pain. The dorsal horn doesn't make any judgment calls as to whether it's pain or not. Your spinal cord doesn't make any judgments as to whether it's pain or not. Only until it hits the thalamus part of your brain does it start to understand that this is pain. And only really until it hits your cerebral cortex do you fully understand it is pain, and it's this intensity of pain and its expected duration of pain. And that perception of pain that happens in the cerebral cortex, it's influenced by all the different biases and all the different inputs and all the different things that you've gone through your entire life. That perception of pain is going to say that ouch is in uppercase, that ouch is in lowercase, or it's NBD. For those of y'all that are older, no big deal, right? So how do you perceive that pain, and how is that perception of pain going to influence your behavior and your choices and how you manage that pain and how you deal with the pain? All of that is really important. So understanding neuroplasticity, understanding how to create new neural pathways that can overwhelm the psychological baggage, the psychosocial issues that are those bad filters, those bad biases that come into it. So when pain happens, your cerebral cortex is set up to be pain resilient, is to be set up for it managing in that, focusing really on that internal locus of control, focusing on self-efficacy, focusing on things that you can do, deep diaphragmatic breathing, stretching exercises, walking around the block, eating more blueberries in the morning, drinking all 75 ounces of liquid every day, all the different things that you can do yourself to self-manage that pain. So as clinicians, you need to understand how the brain works from relation to pain. And obviously clinicians need to understand all the different alternatives: acupuncture, biofeedback, mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance commitment therapy, stretching exercises, yoga and Tai Chi, all these different things. And you need to understand when and how to select, because again, it's not just cookie cutter. You have to decide for this individual what is appropriate. And then ultimately, if they are on these particular drugs, the opioids, the benzodiazepines, and muscle relaxants that become addictive, like carisoprodol, how do you factor a tapering plan? How do you help them understand the withdrawal process? How do you figure out the best approach, whether it's inpatient or outpatient, who to select, what clinicians to be involved, what kind of psychosocial overlay of treatment needs to happen? You need to understand all that stuff. So there's a lot of homework involved for clinicians to get ready for these particular guidelines. But we also need to understand that patients need to have different expectations as well. They really need to figure out how to understand their pain. They need to understand how pain affects their life and how their life may affect their pain. And that can come from lifestyle and day-to-day activities. That can come from their work. It can come from sleep disturbances. Can come from psychological and physical well-being. It can come from social interactions, relationships. Those are all things that are mentioned on the first page of the guidelines, in understanding their pain and helping them understand their pain and helping them understand, be educated, and accept their options. And their options may not necessarily be a pill. Their options may be to do more, be more functional, address the ACEs. If you're not familiar with ACE, the CDC has documented them: adverse childhood experiences. If you encountered some kind of adverse childhood experience, you suffered physical, sexual, emotional abuse as a child, maybe your parents were divorced early, maybe y'all moved a lot, maybe you grew up in difficult socioeconomic circumstances. Those adverse childhood experiences reduce your pain resilience, increase the possibility of addiction as you're an adult. Doesn't guarantee that you're going to be there, but because of those adverse childhood experiences, you've got some psychosocial baggage that you're going to have to deal with in order to be resilient and to be an overcomer as you become older. So understanding and accepting their options and recognizing the fact that the option that they may gravitate to, which may be pills because that's the easiest thing to do, may not be the best long-term or even short-term option for them. They need to change from a fix me attitude, an attitude that somebody or something else is going to take care of it for them, and a less passive, a less kind of I'm in the passenger seat, or I'm in the back seat, or I'm in the trunk and somebody else is driving this. They need to focus on self-efficacy. They need to focus on what they can do themselves. And oftentimes that's not going to be their first option. That's not going to be the first thing that they think of. So they're going to have to be led and educated and empowered and given the tools in order to open up and be available to thinking in terms of, I can do this myself. Now, granted, there's a lot of stuff that they can't do. You can't think a compound fracture, oh, you're probably going to have surgery. You're probably going to have be in a cast. You're probably going to have ongoing therapy. That's stuff that you can't do yourself. But how do you respond to that compound therapy? How do you respond to the physical therapy? Do you do everything the physical therapist tells you to do when you go home? Or are you kind of slacking off and hoping that they won't recognize that, like the dentist always asks, do you floss every day? And of course, everybody says yes, but the vast majority of people don't, right? They can understand, they can see that there's plaque between your teeth and that you don't floss, but you lie anyway. You go to a physical therapist, go, yeah, I did all the exercise you did. And they look at it and go, you're not any better condition than you were when you left here. You're obviously relying on me to do everything. And that's really the opposite of what these guidelines and what common sense says, is really trying to focus on helping that patient, be able to do as much as they can themselves. They need to address their comorbidities, the physical comorbidities, the psychosocial comorbidities, the habits, the bad habits and the good habits. They need to get rid of the bad habits and accentuate the good habits. And they need to evaluate their support system. They need to understand that if they've got some negative people around them, that negativity creates negativity. And the longer you're around negative people, that negativity is going to rub off on you. And maybe you need to change your friends. Maybe you certainly need to change your attitude. So, if you're not getting support at home, maybe they need to be educated that pills are not the right option. So changing patient expectations and helping them understand the role they play. This isn't just something that they show up and have somebody or something else do something to them. They have a significant role ultimately in that. So at the end of the day, there is a new day coming. We don't know when the NICE guidelines are going to be published. We don't really even know what they're going to contain because obviously they're getting feedback, and what is published in August is probably not going to be the final product. But you do know what's coming, unless they completely back off, which doesn't sound like an option. They are coming. Are you prepared? Do you know what's in the NICE guidelines? Have you read them? Do you understand what that means to your practice? Do you understand as a patient potentially what that means as far as what you're going to get? You've got time now to do your homework, and now really is the time to do the homework. I really appreciate the time with you today. You can reach me at the email address. I'd love, if you're not connected with me on LinkedIn, I'd love for you to connect with me there, Mark Pugh. So with that, Dev, I really appreciate, again, the opportunity, invitation to be a part of your conference. And I hope this was helpful to those that saw it.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. I think it was quite an insightful presentation in comparing the CDC guidelines and the proposed NICE guidelines. I think that's really informative to see how the two agencies have taken different approaches towards chronic pain management. I think there are quite a lot of similarities as well. So there's a lot of positives that I see in the NICE guidelines, but certainly some contentious points as well. And I think what I really liked about the presentation was how you elicited how the clinician behavior as well as the patient behavior needs to change to accommodate the NICE guidelines if and when they are implemented. The big question I suppose I have is, our first point of contact are the general practitioners, right? So anytime I have pain, I'll go to my GP and say, look, I'm having pain. What are you going to do about that? And the GP is like, okay, I'll write some medication, go and have this medication for XYZ time, and then we'll review it again. So now, if that option is taken away from the GPs, what are they left with? What are they going to be able to do? And considering you mentioned 15 minutes, and I think that's a big luxury. If our GPs here had 15 minutes, they would think it's a luxury. They probably get about 6 minutes for each consultation. So being able to implement the biopsychosocial model, the learning, everything else within 6 minutes, I think that's going to be a big challenge. And I think that's where a lot of resistance is. So you take away the ability for the GP to take the medication. You say, okay, do physiotherapy, do acupuncture, do XYZ interventions. But though the availability of those interventions is quite restricted in the community. So there's a long waiting time to get to the physiotherapy, or a long waiting time to get to counseling. I think something like 12 weeks to get to counseling. So in the meantime, what is that person going to do? And I think that's the big question that we are facing at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great point. 6 minutes. I can't even eat lunch in 6 minutes, much less try to deduce and diagnose someone who has a painful situation. That's a recipe for writing pills. The easiest way to do that is to write a script. So I think, ultimately, I think it really comes on payers. At this point, and I recognize the medical system in the United Kingdom is quite a bit different than the United States. But in the United States, the payers, the insurance carriers, whether it be Medicare or Medicaid, whether it be the Veterans Administration, whether it be private pay, workers' compensation where I work in, those payers really kind of dictate what happens. And they're the ones that are responsible for reimbursing the provider for their time. And so, and that's where I went into kind of the dialogue that we're having as an industry. What is the right time? Are we limiting the ability for the general practitioner to kind of elucidate all the different things that are happening with this patient? Because really kind of dive into those more detailed. So I can tell you from the United States, what we're trying to figure out is, do doctors need more time in order to dive into more details to understand better what's going on, so then they can provide more options as opposed to, here's a script. So, and then obviously the doctors need to have their homework in advance and go, okay, what is the value of yoga and Tai Chi? What is the value of that stretching and the mindfulness associated with that? Is that something that's beneficial? They may do it themselves, but they may not have ever thought about it as being therapeutic and a part of the medical treatment for something like that. So, how does that apply? So they need to understand that. So long answer to a short question. But, I think in the United States, we're trying to figure out, do we need to expand the time that doctors can spend with the patient, whether it's the MD-DO, whether it's the nurse practitioner, the physician assistant, the clinical extenders, who's involved in that care? Do we need to give them more time to dive into more details, to ask more questions, to allow the patient to talk with them a little bit more? In regards to that. And certainly from a chronic pain standpoint, there ain't no way that you're going to get what you need in 6 minutes to understand for someone who's been in pain for a long time and have been using drugs for long.
Yeah, no, I think you make a fair point that 6 minutes is not, but that is the reality of the GP consultations. And I guess that leads to multiple consultations, and GPs do tend to do the best that they can. I mean, I've known some of the GPs who've had interest in acupuncture, for example, provide acupuncture over multiple sessions and such. So, but that's just one side of the thing. One of the other things that I'm quite sort of interested in understanding is how that would impact on the availability of the drugs in the black market and people using non-recognized or non-licensed drugs to manage their pain. If they're not going to get anything from the GPs and the pharmacies, how that would then play into the black market. And what's your experience from US in that?
Well, I think one of the things that we have done in the US is really public awareness of the dangers of opioids. We have not done a great job in demonstrating the dangers of Xanax and Valium, but we have definitely demonstrated how dangerous OxyContin, Percocet, all those different drugs are. And so the patients themselves, just the general public, understands that is not a good option. And so I think public awareness. So I think with the NICE guidelines, something that should go along with that, and maybe part of that is not just the education to the provider base, the clinicians, but a general education, a general outreach to the public, and explain why these guidelines are coming to bear and what the dangers and how to assess the risks and benefits. Because you're right, if they're coming into an engagement with the treating physician and they're assuming that a drug is going to take care of their problem, and the doctor instead responds with, just get out and exercise, lose a couple of pounds, develop kind of a better resilient attitude, and they kind of pat you on the back and go, have a great day. They're going to walk out of there very disillusioned with that doctor. They would probably give a Press-Ganey patient satisfaction survey right? And so they're going to walk out of there and they're going to find a drug somehow and self-medicate. So I think the general population needs to understand that there is a role for prescription medications, but that role is limited. They need to understand how to assess the risk versus the benefit. One of my favorite websites is drugs.com. You can go to drugs.com and you can look up everything you need to know about that drug. You can look up how it's supposed to be used. You can look up at the potential side effects. You can look at the different drugs that you're not supposed to use with this drug. You can look at the frequency, the possibility of overdose. You can get all the information you need from that. And that's publicly accessible. It's a completely free website. You don't have to pay for anything. So I think one of the ways to keep people from gravitating towards self-medicating when they don't get what they think they need from the doctor, I think the best way to do is a public education outreach to the general public to explain to them, this is why we're going this direction. I think, the best thing to do is to not just focus on education for the clinicians, but to focus public education, overt strategic education to the general population and help them understand that pills may not be the choice.
Excellent. Sounds really good, and I completely agree with you. I think that whole
I figured you would.
is the right thing for them. Excellent. Well, Mark, you're going to be with us for the panel as well, which is going to be running after this. So I think that'll give the delegates a chance to ask you questions and interact with you. following the presentation. But I must say, I think that the way that you've highlighted these similarities and the difference between the CDC guidelines and the experience from US and where we're going with the nice guidance in UK, I think there's lots for us to learn, and there's lots that we can take on board and start to implement in our practice, in our interaction with the patient, but also the wider public health approach towards managing chronic pain better as well. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's been really useful. Thank you.
My pleasure. And I know from the past experience, you're going to have people from Australia, you're going to have people from India, you're going to have people from all across the world. And the one thing I would like to just recommend finally is don't get hung up on the NICE guidelines. Don't get hung up on the CDC guidelines. Focus on best practices, and whatever country that you live in and whatever country you practice in, take those best practices and apply them to your own practice.